King. I'm from BFG Associates, and I'd like to welcome Robert Postlethwaite. Robert was a lawyer who was involved in all the legal aspects of our deal when we sold to our employees in March 2019, in March 2018 that is. And so Robert is from Postlethwaite Employee Ownership Lawyers, and he's going to be sharing his legal knowledge on all aspects of employee ownership trusts. So I mentioned that we sold our business, the Roof Light Company, to our 70 employees in March last year, and I handed over the role of managing director to our operations director, Steve Webber, 1 week before lockdown. So I know how it feels now to draw away from the business. And since March, I've set up BFG Associates, helping people who are exiting their businesses or their practices, and to help them towards employee ownership transition. So I'm going to tell you about how we're going to run the session today. Robert will kick off with his session on the challenges and opportunities of employee ownership trusts. And if you have any questions for Robert, because there are so many of us in the meeting, if you could type those questions into the chat function, that would be great. And then after Robert has finished, I'll put those questions to him and he'll be taking them one by one. So the approach, so then I'm going to address the issue of valuation. At the last webinar, quite a few people asked the question, what approach is taken to valuations in light of COVID-19? And obviously a lot of architectural practices have seen an acute loss in revenue, so it is an important question to ask. So since 2 weeks ago, I've asked quite a few people involved in corporate finance, and one of them is James Shand, who's on this webinar as well. And James was involved in all the financial aspects of our deal. And so we have a couple of opinions, or a few opinions associated with the valuation of businesses, and we'll handle that at the end of the session. So I think that the best way to introduce Robert is I met Robert quite a few years ago, and I hope you don't mind me describing you like this, Robert. But I would describe Robert as a user-friendly lawyer. So I hope you don't feel insulted by that, Robert. But Robert's going to share his knowledge on all the legal aspects of employee ownership. So I think it's over to you, Robert.
Okay, thank you very much, Val, and good morning, everybody. I do have some slides which I'm going to share with you now. So hopefully everybody will be able to see those. Okay, so what I'm going to do is give you an introduction to employee ownership. So this kind of assumes that you are coming to this fresh. If you have already done your own research, then hopefully this will kind of help you recapitulate what you've already read about. So what I'm going to start with is by asking the question, what is employee ownership? And there are three different ways in which a company can be owned by its employees. So I'm just going to run through each of those. The first is what we call direct employee ownership. So in other words, what that means is that each employee of a company has their own share certificates, their own personal shareholding. In other words, if the company makes a profit, they can receive a dividend, and at some point in the future, they can sell the shares that they've been holding. I have to say that's a pretty unusual form of employee ownership, mainly because it's quite complicated, and there's a lot of administration to get involved with. And it's a lot simpler to structure your employee ownership in a different way, which leads me on to my second slide, which is ownership or employee ownership involving something called an employee trust. So that's what I've described as ownership for the benefit of employees. So what you have is this thing called an employee trust. That's an arrangement under which shares in a company are held for the benefit of and on behalf of the employees of that company. So no individual employee actually gets a personal shareholding. That's a lot simpler to set up and to run compared with individual share ownership. And if you look at the architects firms that have already chosen to become employee owned, I can't think of anyone that hasn't done it through this mechanism. But there is a third alternative, which is a mix of the two that I've just described. So in other words, a hybrid of individual and trust ownership. So and that does happen sometimes. So what you see there is usually a majority of the shares in a company are held by an employee trust, but a decision is made to allow a minority holding to be distributed amongst the employees personally. So sometimes that will be a feature of employee ownership. But a lot of the focus this morning is going to be on trust ownership, and in particular, this thing that's been around since 2014 in a very specific form called an employee ownership trust. Now that is very often the particular sort of trust that is chosen by companies in the UK that have decided to go down the employee ownership route, including many architects' practices. It was created in 2014, and there was some government policy behind this, which was very much to encourage more companies to become employee owned. So what they did is they said, well, if you become employee owned by using this thing called an ownership trust or an EOT, then we're going to provide a couple of tax benefits. So the first of those is if you're a business owner and you sell your shares in that business to an employee ownership trust, where the result is the trust has basically majority or complete ownership of the company, then you won't have to pay any capital gains tax. So there's something in it for the selling shareholders. But also, very importantly, once that's happened, it is then possible for the company to pay its employees income tax-free bonuses. So the idea is really to kind of catch the eye of business owners by saying to them, look, if you're looking to sell your company and you're interested in looking at employee ownership, well, if you choose that route, there are a couple of tax reliefs which you might take into account in your thinking. But we do always say, don't just do this for the tax reasons. It's a nice bit of icing on the cake, but it's really important that you think employee ownership is going to be right for your company in other ways. But that is what an employee ownership trust is. Now we think there are probably over 400 UK companies that are owned by employee ownership trusts, and the number is continuing to grow. There is one key condition associated with these tax reliefs, which is that any benefits that employees receive from an employee ownership trust, that must go to all employees, and it must go to all employees on the same terms, which means either everybody gets the same or they get different amounts of benefit depending on things like their salary, their length of service, or their hours worked. So this goes back to the policy behind creating the employee ownership trust, encouraging genuine widespread employee ownership. So it must include all employees. It's not the kind of trust where you can say, well, we like these 3 particular senior employees, so we're going to focus the benefit on them. There is a sort of trust where you can do that, but not one which enjoys these particular tax reliefs. So the EOT tends to be the model used by most firms going down the employee ownership route in the UK. So how does it work? In essence, it's quite simple. So any owners that are looking to retire from the ownership, they agree to sell their shares to the employee trust, and in return for which normally the employee trust would agree to pay them a price, which is based on, well, no more than market value of the shares. So someone will need to come along and advise on what that market value is. Where's the money going to come from? Well, the answer is, if you look at the company in the bottom left-hand corner, that company is going to provide the money out of its profits. So usually you would expect to be paid out over a few years for your shares from the future profits of the company, which it uses to pass to the employee trust, which the employee trust then uses to pay an instalment of purchase price. And you then have the employee trust owning the company on behalf of the employees. So that's really a bit of an introduction. What would you need to think about if you decided you wanted to look at this? So here are some key questions or key legal issues. The first is, who's going to run the employee ownership trust? Who are going to be its trustees? Second, going back to what I mentioned earlier about different forms of ownership, will the trust, the EOT, retain its shares, or will it pass some of them through to employees? Will there be any special share ownership arrangements for key people? So sometimes alongside ownership by the trust, you see an arrangement set up under which, say, the directors of the company have some kind of separate personal rights to acquire a shareholding which perhaps is bigger than the amount of shares, if any, that a particular employee in the company might be able to acquire. And we've certainly worked with a number of architects firms where they've had, say, something like a share option plan for the next generation of directors. What will be the terms of the trustee creating the EOT? So that's the key document which sets out how the EOT is going to work. So we need to think about what's going to go into that. And then the other key document is this purchase contract under which the EOT agrees to buy the shares of the company from those who are selling. So there'll be some things to think about what goes in that contract. It's always a good idea to get clearance from HM Revenue and Customs before you complete the transaction. The reason for that is that what's basically happening in terms of the money is that company profits are coming out of the company to, well, people who are now former shareholders, albeit channeled through the employee ownership trust. And the tax rules say that if shareholders or former shareholders get access to company profits, then the starting point should be that that's treated as like a dividend or what's called a distribution, which means it will be subject to income tax. Well, you don't want that to happen. You want it to be capital gains tax instead, because that means you can claim an exemption. So what you're looking for with the HMRC clearance is for them to say, yes, the appropriate tax is capital gains tax and not income tax, and which opens the way for you then to claim an exemption from tax on all your sale proceeds. And then finally, there's the constitution of the company moving forward. So that's looking at maybe updating its articles of association and possibly having a shareholder agreement if you have the trust as a shareholder and some other individuals, for example, key people in the company, or maybe original shareholders if they're not selling all their shares, which sometimes happens. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Val now, who's going to talk a little bit about valuation. So let me just unshare my screen. Hopefully I've done that. No, I haven't done that yet, but I have now. Thank you very much.
One question which I had for Robert right at the beginning was the question of the Board of Trustees and how you actually decide who is on that Board of Trustees. So I can share with you what we did in our business, but Robert, can you tell me what is a typical setup for a Board of Trustees in terms of numbers and what makes up their profile?
Yeah, very happily. So the first thing to say is that there aren't really any rules. There's nothing in the EOT legislation that says this is the kind of person you have to have as a trustee. But there's a bit of common sense I think you can apply. And what I interpret as common sense would work as follows. So the first thing is it's a good idea if you can to have an odd number of trustees, which should remove the risk of a deadlock ever occurring on a particular question. Second, it's good to have, it is an employee ownership trust, therefore it kind of makes sense to have at least one employee as a trustee. I think it's also good to have at least one independent person if you can find somebody who's willing to perform this role, who comes from outside the company. And then let's say if you have 3 trustees, you have maybe one employee, one independent person, and then the third one could be another employee, or could be one of the retiring shareholders, or could be a member of the senior management team in the company. But that's just one model, slightly different from what the case is at Postlethwaite Val, I think.
Yeah, so we decided to have more independent trustees, and so we have 3 independent trustees, and they are chosen. 2 of them were chosen by myself and Peter, and then 1 was chosen by the board of directors. And the reason for that was we wanted to ensure that we have somebody scrutinising, if you like, the company and how it's run. So that was something that we decided to do. The other 3 trustees are myself as the outgoing shareholder. It was Peter when I was still managing director, and then we have 2 co-owner trustees, one who is a manager and one who's not a manager, and they are selected by their peers. One thing I felt very strongly about, and this does happen with some organisations, where in our case, the Board of Trustees does not include any of the executive team. So it does not include any of the Board of Directors. And I felt very strongly about the fact that the Board of Directors should be held accountable by the Board of Trustees. And so it's something where the Board of Trustees meetings are very much a presentation on the part of the Board of Directors to the Board of Trustees, where the Board of Trustees then say, well, hang on a minute, how's this going to work? And so they actually hold them accountable. That is not always the case, and some people feel less strongly about that. So we have another question, Robert. How long does it take?
I would say a minimum of 3 months from a standing start. And we have actually on 1 or 2 occasions set up an employee ownership trust in slightly less than that period. But ideally, you would allow yourself a reasonable amount of time. It's important not to rush things. And many companies, and I think Postlethwaite would definitely include themselves in this, would say actually it's good to take longer than 3 months. It's good to be really quite diligent and careful about your planning. You may also even want to consider setting up some sort of representative group of employees and allow them to feed into aspects of the planning process. That's not something you have to do, but that's what some companies do.
Yeah, so that's considered good practice. And we waited till after the transition to form what we call the voice group, and that is 5 people who represent a sort of geographical area in the business. And so the voice group then speak to the Board of Trustees as well as to the Board of Directors about any aspects about the business. And it is very much in the spirit of speaking truth to power. So they are the ones who know what's going on on the ground. And so the Board of Directors might be thinking, well, everything seems to be fine, but maybe it isn't. And so it's a very important aspect of employee ownership, where representation is firmly placed into the way that things are done. And that's, again, more the spirit of employee ownership, although some businesses don't have a representative body. So we have another question. Crystal ball gazing, is there any likely change to tax and process in the future? Do we need to get in place quite soon?
Shall I have a bash at that one?
Yeah.
Well, it's always rash to try and predict what's going to happen with tax rules. But I would say that the tide is very much in favour of wider employee ownership. And you will find cross-party political support for wider employee ownership as well. So my personal view is I think it's unlikely that there would be any adverse changes to the employee ownership tax regime. And in fact, there's a certain amount of lobbying going on to make it even more attractive than it is. Whether that will get anywhere is very hard to say. But don't quote me on that in terms of I'm promising you there's never going to be a change to the tax position. What you can be confident about, though, is that if you did go down the employee ownership trust route, then certainly the tax reliefs aren't going to be changed retrospectively. So if you claim capital gains tax relief, for example, and you sold your shares, then it's really impossible to imagine that will be reversed. But generally, I'm pretty optimistic.
Good. And James, would you like to comment on the aspect of tax? Thank you, Robert.
Yes, I think in terms of tax, the tax advantages are quite useful. I probably have a maxim, which is that the tax tail should never wag the commercial dog. So don't do it just for tax. Absolutely don't do that. Tax benefits are there for the seller, but also they're very advantageous for the employees and paying out profit share in the future. So up to 3,600 per person, free of PAYE is pretty helpful. It's very helpful. So that is useful, and it goes along the way to sort of oiling the wheels. But it's a complex transaction, probably more complex in some respects than other deals, but so you should do it for your motives. If your motives are for the legacy, then absolutely do it, and the tax benefits are an ancillary, nice sort of cherry on the top, really.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question for Robert. What tends to happen in the period where the trust is buying out the existing owners?
Okay, so what happens is the sale of the shares will be completed in one go. So the ownership of the company would change overnight and become employee owned. What is going to take longer generally is payment for the shares. And that can take anything between 4 to 5 or even up to 10 years. Depending on the price attached to the business. Broadly, in terms of what happens, the key thing really is to engage the employees in the fact that they are now the owners, and that is probably the most important part of the process, getting that right, because they weren't used to being owners. It will be a new thing. It will also be change, and people often don't like change. So they might even feel possibly discomforted by that. So, but there's a massive opportunity to engage the employees and turn them into owners, and that's your biggest task, I think, actually, over that period.
Great, thank you, Robert. Further question, I read somewhere that a maximum of 40% of employees can hold more than 5% each of shares within 12 months of transitioning to an EOT model. Is this correct?
So there is a rule which says that if you are or have been a 5% shareholder in the company, then you can't be a beneficiary of the EOT. So what does that actually mean in practice? It means if the EOT ever confers any financial benefit on employees, then it can't include anyone who's a 5% plus shareholder. But you can still receive an income tax-free bonus. even though you're a significant shareholder in the company. And actually, it's the bonus that in reality, on a sort of year-to-year basis, is the most likely way in which you're going to get a financial reward by being an employee owner. So in practice, I'm not sure if it makes an awful lot of difference unless and until the company is sold by the EOT. Now, that may never happen. In fact, many companies go into employee ownership intending that this is a long-term or even a permanent thing. But occasionally you will see a further ownership change in which the trust sells its shares on to a third-party buyer. And then it's sitting on some sale proceeds. What would normally happen with those sale proceeds is that they're passed out to the employees. And if you're a 5% shareholder, then you won't be able to participate in that share of sale proceeds. But then again, you'll be getting your own share because you'll have sold your 5% plus shareholding. So there is an issue, but in practice, I'm not actually sure if it's a really great worry.
Okay, so I'm sure that that is satisfied their curiosity on that aspect. So what I'd like to do now is to talk about valuation, and then Robert, obviously your experience in valuations would be welcome as well. So I'll share my screen for this aspect of valuation. Right, how will valuations be affected by COVID-19? So just to go back to some basics on how a valuation method is normally calculated, it's based on the EBITDA, earnings before, the definition of profit, for example, EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization. And then it's multiplied by a profit multiple based on typically on the BDO Private Companies Index. And this is sometimes done, and this was the case in our case, in our valuation, in combination with a market approach. So looking at comparable transactions. And James shared that, in fact, James, would you like to talk about this aspect of EBITDAC?
Yes, I hope folks are familiar with EBITDA. It's sort of profit, but EBITDAC is an interesting one. The challenge is, how do you value a business when it's been impacted severely by COVID-19 and lockdown? And the answer is this EBITDAC formula, which is to actually adjust the results of the company, taking into account as if COVID-19 hadn't happened. It's probably easier to say than to actually do, but that's the principle.
Okay. Thank you for that, James. So when asking James and others who are involved in corporate finance as well, I was about this question of valuation. The big question is, what is the medium-term impact of the virus and lockdown? And so, for example, this depends on the level of impact. If the business have reduced in size by, say, a third, then this would indicate a more permanent change, and the impact of the valuation would be greater. So, if, for example, there were quite a few redundancies made in this period, then it would definitely change the overall value of the company or the firm. But if, for example, projects were it was a matter of being put on hold, and the firm was kept in the same sort of shape and form as pre-COVID-19, then the valuation would not be impacted so much. And one way of approaching this, it was suggested by a member of the corporate finance team at Price Bailey, was that an earnout might be a possibility. So if the business is valued at, say, 100,000, then the owner could agree an initial sum of 600 and then an earnout based on the future profits of the business. Or they could do the same as we did, consider selling a majority share. It still has to be a 51% share. In our case, it was 60% in the short term, and then sell the balance of shares at a later date. So James, James or Robert, do you have any thoughts? Robert, firstly, do you have any thoughts on valuation at the moment?
No, I think that's all pretty good and pretty clear, actually. The only thing I'd add is that I know that the revenue are very quickly, as early as late March this year, were aware that there could be a valuation impacts of COVID-19, and have, in a slightly different context, have been willing to look at a much more flexible approach to valuation. But it will very much depend on the company. I think that's the
Right.
key.
Okay, and James, would you like to comment?
Thank you. Yes, I think that those are all interesting angles on there. I think that the warning I'd put out on the earnouts is that if you switch to an earnout, then that may well blow your entrepreneurs relief. And in fact so might blow that completely. So that needs to be done with a lot of care. And it tend to be harder to structure as well. So it's not as simple as a transaction as a straight sell into EOT or EBT or whatever into the trust. So I think I'd be more cautious about an earnout. I think the way that Val, you did it, if I may say, was better in terms of selling out 60% and then retaining 40% for a later transaction.
Mm. Yes, and in fact, for those of you who were at the webinar 2 weeks ago, Peter Morris of Alfred Hall, Mornington Morris, they actually came to the same level of selling 60%. And then they have said that once the debt is paid, once the amount for the shares has been paid, they will actually gift the 40% to the firm. So that's their approach. So, what I would like to point you to is to James's website in terms of selling the services associated with the business sale, and to Robert's, which Robert, it's on there as well. In fact, I've got it up here. Yes, so we've got postlethwaite.co.com. Also, Oliver, I know, is on the call from the Employee Ownership Association. I'd like to signpost that website to anyone who is interested in employee ownership, because it covers all aspects of employee ownership. And it's a wealth of material on all things employee ownership related, where you will be able to get a lot of case studies and any questions you can actually direct to them directly to the Employee Ownership Association. So I'm just going to stop the share to just double check that we have no more questions on the chat. I don't think there are.
Could I just chip in another point on the valuation side? Yeah. We often say with deals that what you're looking for is how you strike a valuation is around what a willing a seller wants to sell for and a willing buyer wants to buy for. And in the case of an employee ownership transaction, it's the buyer that's the kind of question mark. So who is the buyer, and how do you've got to sort of double think forward to say, okay, so what would your employees later on perhaps view of your transaction? And so is it a fair value? Will they judge it as a fair value in the future when you finally do brief it to them? Which we'd certainly urge. Our experience at Rooflight was definitely that was a really positive thing to do. But as long as you've got a fair value and you haven't overvalued the company. So just add that.
Yes, and I can imagine, and this would, Robert, you might know this, you'll be aware of this as well, that the valuation has got to pass HMRC. Their standards must be rigorous in terms of the valuation being compliant with everything that they would expect. So
yes, I mean, they won't necessarily ever look at it, but there's always a possibility that they might come along and say, well, let's have a look at this employee ownership trust transaction you did, and we want to satisfy ourselves that the sellers haven't been overpaid for their shares, because if they had been, that would be the revenue would be saying, well, we'd like some income tax on all that surplus, please. So it's really important to have a kind of well put together, fairly robust valuation. So the revenue will look at that and say, okay, yeah, we're happy with that. And there are valuations around, ways of getting a company around. I'm not going to name any names, but there's a website you can go to and plug in a few bits of financial information and hand over £500, and like magic, you'll get a value for your company. I wouldn't recommend doing that, because if the revenue do ever come along, it's probably not going to stand up very well. If you get your accountant, or if your accountant doesn't want to do it, another accountant who's experienced in valuations to do it, then you'll have something that will withstand revenue scrutiny, and you can be confident in if that ever happens.
Yeah. And I would point everyone in the direction of, again, in the EOA, to people who are experienced in employee ownership, both from the financial and the legal point of view, because there are some aspects of employee ownership that are important to know, and having that experience with deals is critical. And that's certainly something that Pete and I wanted to make sure that we had somebody who actually was familiar with how the setup was. And so that's something that is certainly important to us when we set out the team we wanted to actually make the transition happen. So the next webinar is I'll be talking about how we transitioned to employee ownership. So I used a project management approach, which involved 4 main stages: preparation, defining the optimum solution, and then the implementation and integration. So I'll be going through, from a business owner point of view, what actually happens, and that includes some of the emotions that you go through, which go from feeling everything's fine to what are we doing. But one thing I would say in terms of employee ownership, doing the right thing sometimes when there are lots of complex issues, external and internal, then doing the right thing is sometimes the easiest thing to do, because you know underneath it all that it's coming from the right place. So I would say that from an emotional point of view, that was true in our case. And then James is going to be speaking about the financial aspects of preparing for transition to employee ownership. So those are on the 24th of July and then the 14th of August. And I'll be sending out invitations to those webinars in next week is when it's going to happen. So unless anyone has some burning questions on the aspects of employee ownership, what I'd like to do is to thank Robert very much for your knowledge and sharing that, and to James for helping with the valuation aspect. So thank you very much, and have a lovely weekend, everyone, and I hope the sun shines on you throughout the next few days. Apparently the weather is improving, thank goodness.